Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to the next episode of NativeScript Air. I think this is the episode number 7. And today we are going to talk about building attractive UIs in NativeScript. So I've got with me a couple of big community members. So I have Sean Perkins over there and Alex Ziskin. Do you guys want to introduce yourself quickly?
Yeah, sure. My name is Sean Perkins. I'm developer expert for NativeScript. I work at a company called Maestro in Kalamazoo. We do software development for custom apps and products. Love NativeScript, love JavaScript, love TypeScript. Love to be here. Glad to be here, and love to build apps.
Awesome. Excellent. And we also have Alex.
Sean is also an author on nativescripting.com, which is a site that I started. He just released a course recently, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So I run and operate, and I also teach on this site called NativeScripting. So I provide courses to students, and I also do development.
Excellent. Oh, and is this where you sit? Is that where you record your sessions? Because it looks like you have some soundproofing just behind you.
Indeed, it is. This is my studio.
Oh, excellent, excellent.
Sean's got his setup as well over there.
Kind of a wall of it.
Nice. I should get one of those as well. Yeah, I'm actually today in the NativeScript office in Bulgaria, so not calling you guys from home this time. So let's get on a topic. So how do you guys go about actually building applications that look attractive, that look nice and professional? Like, what is your process like? How do you do that?
Sure. So I'm going to start off. I'm going to kick this off with a little presentation, and then Sean is going to go into a little more detail about a real-world application that's really cool looking and styled very well. So I'm going to share my screen so everybody can see.
Hey, that's me.
That's a handsome devil.
There you are. Okay. So we're talking today about building attractive UIs in NativeScript. Now, when I start thinking about making an app look good, I start asking some questions. One of the questions is, when does an app start to look good? This is sometimes a tricky question. So we'll get back to this. And what does it mean for an app to look good? That look good part is also questionable. What does it mean? It means different things to different people, right? Is it just pretty colors? Well, we'll get back to this also. Let me start with a story, and you tell me if this sounds familiar to you. Now, Susan here, she's a NativeScript developer, and she's got a task in front of her. Let's say she has to create a master detail pages for her company's new mobile issue tracking system. So she's got to create this app. She goes to work on it and comes back the next day because it's pretty simple to put together. You can even use a template that comes with NativeScript. And she comes back with a pretty decent looking master details app. Even the colors match the company branding, and it has a logo. And since Susan didn't have a design to base her pages on, she did as best as she could when it comes to styling the app. She used CSS and some out-of-the-box transitions that come with NativeScript. Now, time goes by, and let's say 2 weeks later, or maybe even longer, as you might know, the boss asks her to change the colors of the font and increase the size of the user images. So let's say she comes back with something that looks like this. Not bad, right? You have your list of items. So this is the master page. The boss says, go ahead, change the font color up, increase the size of the image so I can see it better. This is fine. It's pretty simple, and Susan still kind of remembers what she did 2 weeks ago, but it still takes her a little time to locate the styles and change them. She even has to play around with the layout a little bit to accommodate the larger images. So she comes back with something that looks maybe like this. And the story repeats. 2 weeks later, the boss asks Susan again to switch the position of the images and the color indicator, add a color indicator to show what type of item we're looking at. So she gets to work again. Now she comes back with version 3. So at this point, Susan had to completely redo the layout structure of each list item, and this takes some time. And I think you get where I'm going with this. Now, after a while, you're going to get to version 99 and blah, 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 and this keeps going. Now, Susan is changing code here every single time. She's updating styles, she's moving layouts. This is very expensive and it's time consuming. Could Susan have done something different in the beginning of the task to simplify the back and forth conversations about design? And I think, yes, she could have. Let's take a look at 3 different types of Susan. These are different working scenarios that she or you can find yourself in. So Susan works on a team with designers is one scenario. If you're on this kind of team, the design will be handed to you and your app will look good. So you just convert what the designer gave you into working CSS and style code. Okay. Scenario 2, Susan is on a team of developers and only developers. There's no design team. Now, it is the responsibility of one of the devs to incorporate a design cycle into the dev cycle and make the app look good here. The other scenario is Susan works for a team of 1, which is just Susan. Now, if you're wearing many hats, or in this case, all the hats, then it's your responsibility to make the app look good. Yes, Susan, it's your responsibility. Let's get back to the initial questions. When does the app start to look good? Well, I believe that the app starts to look good before there is even an app. Now, the tools Shawn and I will show you today will let you do this very simply without great expense. And it's an important step. And the other question we had, what does it mean for an app to look good? Does it have pretty colors? And there's lots of answers for this. A mobile app has to have, of course, the branding to support the company colors and logos and so on. You can also incorporate animations, which I'll talk about in a second. Now, the most important thing is intuitive user interaction. This will make the app look good. If you are caring about UX and user experience and you've thought about it ahead of time, this will make the app look good. It might not be colors, or it might be colors. It might be animations. So speaking of animations, a lot of people think animations are, just extra and unnecessary, but animations are very important. And if they're done correctly, then they're going to provide information. So animation as information, that's the way I like to think about it, is provide enough that you're giving the user more information than they can see. And that's, animations that show probably some kind of micro interaction that allow user to tap on a heart icon, and the heart icon will wiggle a little bit to indicate that the heart icon was tapped if you're liking something on Twitter, for example. So let's talk a little bit about what can be done to have all this come together for you as a developer. Now, these days we have tools, lots of tools. Developers have very little excuse these days not to do some work ahead of time to get good designs and to make things look good. Tools today are bridging the gap between designers and developers. And designers sometimes have to do a little coding, and just like designers do that, developers also should get into their world a little bit and use some of these tools that I'll show you and Shawn will show you. This will save you many hours of work of rearranging CSS and layouts. Now, these tools that we're going to talk about today are fairly simple, and all you got to do is just download it and start playing with it, really. There's two tools I want to talk about today. One of them is called Sketch. Sketch has a free trial, so you really have no reason to avoid it. Here is a Sketch. I downloaded it, and it's really one of the simplest tools you can use. Let's say I want to put together some kind of layout for a native application. I can come here, create an artboard, and I'm just creating shapes. So I want to create a shape for my iOS application, for example, or any kind of app, really. So let's create an example here, and I'll just show you how simple this really is. So we have our row, individual row here. I can just change colors here. Now, I'm not a designer. I'm a developer, and I've been a developer for a long time. I'm not going to go into that, but there's NativeScript dog. We're going to put him in there. So I don't really know much about design is what I'm trying to get at. But this tool is so simple that even I enjoy using it. And this is going to save you so much time in the long run if you start using this today. So I'm going to add some text here. Let's say I want to add this is basically a list of items that Susan is developing, right? So I'm going to create this very quickly and just show you how simple it is so you can do it yourself. Now there's the item, and I want to change the color. Let's say I want to go to a different size. And there we go. There is my item. I can duplicate this. And what's really cool about this is that it's so simple to use. And I've created, a layout here that I can easily modify. And let's say that our boss comes back and says, well, this picture is too far away from this edge. You don't need to go and play around with CSS and modify it. You can just come in here, move this a little bit here, and there you go, you're done. So this tool is something simple, and it has a free trial. And even after the free trial, it's quite inexpensive. So I highly recommend you grab this. Now, it does have some prototyping built into it. They're starting to it, but it's not as advanced as some other prototyping tools that Shawn will talk about. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is a tool that looks pretty similar to this, and it's called Principle. So here is the continuation of that project. You can open up your sketch, your sketch files in Principle for further, for going into it further. So this you can create animations and micro interactions in this tool. So for example, you can see that this thing comes to life. I can just start interacting with it. And I define my animations just by dragging these lines and creating a timeline between different screens. So let's say there's my details. I can switch between these different pages here. And those are my little micro interactions. And I can open up the menu and close that. So after a while, you can tweak your animations to your heart's content without ever touching code. And you're getting these micro interactions designed, which means you're going to know what every little interaction is going to look like before you're even creating complex animations in code. So this is one way to prototype, and Shawn will talk about Envision, which is another way to prototype. And at the end, you get some kind of result when you finally decided to go ahead and code your application after all the kinks have been worked out with the boss, and the boss is no longer asking you to make tweaks. And then you get an app that looks something like this, where it's a functional working app. So that's what I wanted to talk about as far as the tools. And really, there is no reason for you not to play around with these. They do, both of these tools have free trials that are pretty long, and you'll be able to pick these up pretty quickly. These are very simple tools to use.
Cool.
So, yeah, go ahead.
Can I just ask quickly a question? So there was a question from the audience. So do you also use Sketch for Android, or do you usually use it just for iOS? So do you Android, iOS, or just one of them?
So Sketch is a tool. It's a design tool. You can think of this as iOS, or you can think of this as Android. It really doesn't matter. So some of the devices here, you'll be able to pull down, and you can select Android. Now, these are just shapes. It doesn't really matter what they are. They're just predefined for you, so you don't have to know what pixel dimensions to use. So there's your Android Pixel 2, Pixel 2 XL, and the some Nexus models there. But really, they just give you a board to work with a certain size. What you put inside of it is just a design. So it doesn't matter if it's iOS or Android. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
So it looks just like, so that you get a feeling of how much can fit depending on the size as well, etc.
Yeah. Correct.
Yeah.
And we use it at our place of work for even our web applications as well.
Nice.
So yeah, I just want to conclude this by saying that, most of us that are developers and are slinging code for a living and building apps, we're not designers, right? So I'd say don't leave design to chance. Be prepared. These tools are simple. Get out there, download them, and try them out. If Shawn, you want to go into a little more about the rest of it and how you can use your sketch designs in the next step with Envision, then you can take over.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll start screen sharing.
Excellent.
So at Maestro, what we do is we're the first instance. So I'm a developer on a team, but I also have a designer that hands off the project to me. And our designer develops our projects inside of Sketch, which I would agree to what you said, Alex, that it's a great design tool, and there's really no excuse for not at least trying it out. It's great for quickly mocking up designs. And if you don't want to use Principal, there's this alternative solution called Envision, which is an online service, which is free for personal use, and I think like up to maybe 3 projects, but then obviously there's a payment tier if you use it for professional use. And what happens is after you upload your sketch designs, they basically become little artboards inside of what's called Envision. And you can actually line up these and add what they call like hotspots to make those interactions for animations and for screen changes. So for instance, this is our home screen inside of our application. And when you tap here, out slides a side drawer. And you can add opacity for a background, and it just kind of fades away when you click off. And the best thing that I found about Envision, and the best thing for development purposes, is their inspect tool that's built into the application. And what the inspect tool is it allows you to highlight on these specific shapes, and it'll generate out code for you. So the nice thing about this is by default, it outputs Objective-C code. And in the settings for Envision, you can actually change both the point or the units for it, the code, and then what type of color, like maybe it's hex or RGBA that you want out. So for instance, for most NativeScript applications, you're doing DPI units, and you probably want it either CSS or SAS. So we'll just do CSS for this instance. And then for the color codes, we want it to be hex. And the cool thing now is I can go through my whole design that was exported out of Sketch, and I can see, okay, this title right here, what's the font face? What's the font weight? What's the color, the alignment, the spacing? And then it also generates all of it in a nice CSS block. It gives it a preset CSS class. Now, not always are they well named. I would recommend renaming them to something that's more fitting to what you're doing. Obviously, if you're dealing with typography like this, where you have different headings, you might have like an H1 class or an H2 class, or maybe even a title class that you put all this generic styling underneath. And where this becomes really useful is for spacing. As you're kind of going through the application, you kind of see it shows different spacing and alignments between different cells. And I can see quickly all of what I need to build out my design. And I just basically, in my world, I will copy and paste this into my NativeScript application. I'll run it, and I'll just see how close it is to the actual design, and I'll make tweaks where I need to. But now I don't have to guess what the font weights are, what the font sizes are. I can just quickly click, it copies to my keyboard, and I can paste it inside of VS Code. So that's, I'd say, the biggest win for Envision is just the rapid prototyping capabilities that it gives you by being able to inspect the designs at a developer perspective, not just from a design perspective. And other than that, it's, I mean, we use it for our tablet layouts. I can jump back. We have a mobile layout for our phone, and it all behaves the same. It's very much like Sketch, where, you know, the outer shell is just a predefined grid of the width and height of the device that you're working with. And then it allows you to, like you showed on the segmented bar inside of Principal, you click through and it just shows those interactions. And this is great for if you're on the third tier of Susan, if you're just your own team, a team of one, and your job is also to sell this or interact with your end user, your customer. This is a great way before you actually start developing to just kind of give them a good feel of what the application is going to behave like. So you save time and a lot of back and forth, because to most people who aren't developers, when they jump into this, they feel like this is like the app. It's switching between screens like you would expect on a device. It has animations and jump throughs, and that'll allow them to give you a lot of feedback in terms of if they like the interactions, if they like the display, and then you can just develop it once instead of developing it 12 to 15 times to get them to a happier point for production.
Now, is there a way to import your Sketch files into Envision?
Yes, so that would be something that I personally haven't done. That's something that our designer does when he updates his Sketch files. He actually has a pretty neat process. I'm not exactly sure the tool. I can comment it back on the NativeScript Air channel after I connect with him, but it's very similar to GitHub, and it allows him to create branches of his Sketch files. And he can actually create a working branch to match a feature branch for us in development. And he can just upload that specific branch of Sketch to Envision. So that way we always see whatever version we're working on, be it, you know, I'll see if you put like this Sketch file, he hasn't updated the version, but if we were working on, you know, 3.1.3, he could branch off, create that in Sketch, upload it to Envision, and we would only be able to see the changes that were for the 0.3 minor release.
Quick question. So can you also export those projects from Envision, like to anything that's useful, or do you just copy and paste the individual settings? Like, could you export things to like Objective-C or Swift or
yeah,
like
so
JavaScript?
You can't do JavaScript. So this is very design mentality and not so much the experience or the development side of it. But you can change for the exporting side of it. You can change it from being obsessed or from CSS to Objective-C, and it'll actually give you those different layers and those different offsets and colors like that.
Oh, very nice.
Which is handy if you're building, you know, like maybe a plugin that you have like some reusable UI and you're not exactly sure what properties to use and you don't want to Google it. You can just click through here and quickly get that Objective-C code to paste in. Now, I will say it's very iOS focused. Now, obviously, the CSS applies for both Android and Android and iOS, but the XML side of it is a little more rough in terms of the Android export. It's not very code specific.
Yeah, and I've used Envision for a while back for web projects, and I see they've made a lot of improvements as far as mobile apps go, and that's very nice to see.
Yeah, I would say we initially started with web project for this, and it's been amazing just to see how far they've come, especially for reusable UI, because as you're jumping through these screens, you can actually, without clicking, you can navigate between screens, and beforehand there'd be a lot of jumping between it. But now that we have reusable components, it looks, you know, one-to-one depending on whatever screen you're on.
So wait, so if you like one of those components, so if you change it in one place, you automatically update on all the pages that use that component?
Correct. So that goes back to Sketch, where you've seen Alex make a symbol.
Oh, yeah.
So for the list item, if you update just that list item cell to have that updated styling with, you know, NativeScript dog, maybe you bump up the font size and the color, and you export that and sync it up with Envision. Anywhere that you're using that list view symbol will actually update throughout your project, which is really useful if you're making kind of a global change to your app.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. To be honest, like we sometimes like work with our design teams, like when we work on some demo projects, etc. And like the process that you described looks a lot easier to versus what we are going against. So maybe I'll send them a link to this video after, say like, hey guys, how about you try this? Because that sounds pretty awesome.
Yeah, I would say our biggest hassle as your development team grows, you're obviously working on different features. I work on obviously the NativeScript side with OC, TriniWiz in the NativeScript community, and then we have a web developer. And the cool thing about our project is we code share between web and native. So we're working on the same project. But our web team is always a little bit further ahead in terms of in terms of the features they're implementing for our app. And for native, we kind of follow up behind them and implement the feature to get feature parity. Well, there's points in the design process where the design will change for web, but we're far enough behind in native that we don't necessarily want to pick up, that new change. And I mean, the advantage of that process I was talking about, where we actually can create branches inside of with Sketch and version them out, it allows us not to become our own enemy. I'm not getting mad at the designer for doing his job of getting ahead to get our web team further ahead, and I can work and look at directly what I need to do. And that just saves a ton of time and prevents a lot of conflict too. And it also allows us to kind of think ahead too. So I'd say the biggest thing with design iteration is when you're on that phase one, that first iteration, you're not really thinking ahead about, what's this going to look like on the 50th iteration or the 70th iteration. And that's kind of what Alex was talking about, of building out your CSS and your styling with purpose and abstracting things out and thinking ahead in terms of like typography and colors and things like that. Just save time as you're iterating on your project.
Yeah, that definitely sounds a lot more professional. It's kind of like have a nice workflow to follow. Don't just try to improvise on daily basis. That can bite you.
For sure. And it doesn't always go crystal clear. I mean, obviously the plot or the process looks great when you do it, and in actuality, about 80% of the time it works great, but 80% is better than the 0% of not doing it at all.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, yeah, you have to be flexible, right? It's a best practice, not something that you have to follow like some sort of religious book, right? So
yeah,
but it helps if you do it.
It's definitely a case-by-case basis too. I mean, sometimes with development and with customer demands, you kind of have to think on your feet. And sometimes you're actually developing before your designers had the time to really think through the whole design of what they're trying to build. So you're just trying to rapidly prototype something out. And I mean, you're satisfying the need of the customer, and that's the most important thing in at least our world. Is money is what drives business, and then when you can follow up.
Yeah, but at that point, you're not focusing on your colors, your font sizes, your image sizes. You're just getting them some kind of working prototype, and that's where we really get bogged down. Is change the font color, change the size of the image. So that's where that's another layer that comes in later that you can apply on top of your prototype.
Absolutely. And I think for a lot of people, they need to kind of pause after you finish your prototype and realize that that's what you built was a prototype. It's not actually the application that you want to make to a production grade, and kind of go back and think fresh of, okay, I have this design. It looks close to what I'm going to need in the end product, but can I abstract out some of the styling? Can I move some of these layouts so they're using no heading tags, or can I make some reusable SAS functions or SAS classes to really help me as I build out the project further? And so I'm not just copying and pasting CSS code from one component to another, from one page to another.
Totally.
Right.
Yeah, and in a way, like to me, this looks like if you have this nice design, you can basically use it to agree with your customer on it. So you can also become part of the contract that you, like the statement of work that you can sign with your customer. So there's like a lot less miscommunication, and you can do it a lot earlier.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a level of accountability on both sides. The customer has a good expectation of what they're going to receive. And as long as you design it exactly how the design is, and Envision does help you get closer to that by exporting out that CSS, then in the end goal, you're developing something with the end goal of it going to be this, and the customer also has the same expectations. So when they deliver to it, it's a lot less of like, hey, you said this, but with design, a lot of times, people think differently. They think something sounds a specific way, but the animation behaves differently, the colors are different, the experience is different.
Yep, I totally agree. So once you have that design then, and you start implementing, like, how does it look like on your side? More like, do you have any good tips in terms of, like you mentioned already, maybe creating reusable classes in SAS? Like what sort of things do you use, or do you have anything to share with us as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I can share the project here in a second. I would say for our specific project, we have a lot of variations with our components, and we try to abstract out our components more in the Angular side. It's a NativeScript Angular application. So we have reusable Angular components, and we do a lot of configuration with our designs through code as well. And I'll jump in and explain that more. But for more of the global styling, we do use heading tags wherever possible. Excuse me. We do try to use reusable color classes wherever possible. Our application is, it's an enterprise application. And what I mean by that is each tenant or each company that leverages it has their own instance. So they have their own branding needs as well. So our application allows users, well, specifically the organization as a whole, to change the primary accent color of the application to match their branding guidelines. So by default, the project is red, as you saw in the Envision app, as the primary accent color. But I believe when I jump in and I'll show this demo, the tenant or the organization that I'm logged into, we just set up their brand color to be like this turquoisey green. And the cool thing with what you can do in NativeScript, and it was super easy, you can just basically import in application, and you can do app.add.css, and you can inject a bunch of styling into the root page of your application, and it'll actually override any CSS that you've defined in your application. So that's how you do these overrides of brand colors and things like that on a per organization or per user basis. So I guess I'll just jump right into that, and I'll show this. Cool. I'll show that application that we were looking at in Envision. We'll only look at the iPad version of it for this instance, but do know that this application is both phone and tablet, and it's all through the same application. That's kind of the huge win of NativeScript for us, was being able to build out our Android application, our phone version, and our tablet version all in one. Mm-hmm. So I'm logged in this application. You can see here that I have this kind of green look over here. There's actually, it takes your avatar and it shoves it in the background. It's kind of hard to see just based on how my avatar has got me and my dog in it. But if it was just my face, it would actually be a little bit easier to tell that it's my face in the background. You actually see a little bit better here. You kind of see the dog and me.
Oh yeah, there it is.
And you can see that the icons themselves too, the foreground colors of those are this turquoise green. And as we go through our application, we do have this consistent branding of this green or whatever the organization chooses. Now what I'll do, and hopefully the demo gods are with me on this one, I'm going to quickly jump into our web application, because our web application actually has a different experience than the native application. And what I mean by that is we have a both user side of the application and an admin side of the application. Now the web interface serves both user and admin, but for our specific use case, our native application only needed to satisfy the user end of the app. So all the admin configurations are all done through the web portal. Now I'm not a super admin, so already the demo gods are not with me, but we'll quickly log in.
That's a pretty beautiful website, any app so far.
Thank you.
I'm impressed.
Looks really good.
So for the sake of this demo, we'll choose, I don't know, we'll try to find like a NativeScript blue. Right?
Yes.
And we'll save it. And I mean, obviously in our web application, it updates immediately, but let me minimize back. Log into. They're not with me because that color did not update, but you can see on a fresh install, you would get it. There it goes.
Yeah, some of the colors updated there.
It's a little delayed, but you can see obviously that brand color took over for the cover bar and some for the icon classes. Obviously the navigation is being a little bit finicky, but that's just kind of how these live demos go. This is a development branch that I'm on, not on the master.
Now, so this is running on a simulator, on iOS simulator right now on your device, right?
Yes, this is running on the iOS simulator.
Wow. And you have the colors updated somewhere in the database, and you're pulling in the colors that way.
Yep. So we use the Nest.js framework for our backend, and we have a variety of microservices that kind of associate themselves with it. And what I mean by microservices is we have pre-built things that we use across different applications. So this is one application, but we might have 10 or 15 clients that'll have the same need. So we have like an Amazon S3 service that people can upload data to. And we have a database service that just handles, saving directly into we use Postgres, so we save to our Postgres database. So what happens is as soon as you're, in the web interface, you obviously save, the next network call for the iOS application will update the branding.
Mm-hmm.
Now we have that tied to login because we prioritize how we want to refresh data. And we've noticed with performance, certain things just don't need to be updated very often. So for instance, a brand color. An organization to go through a brand color change is a significant deal. It can take weeks to months for them to actually migrate and make that change. If you think of like the big companies like Ford or Toyota or any car manufacturer, they've made small brand changes, but it's almost like on a yearly or bi-yearly basis. So for us, refreshing that brand color is not as important as reloading data for the username or if their roles change behind the scenes. So we only reload brand data on login or on session expiration.
Makes sense.
And then in terms of design on this, a cool thing with our application is we have both portrait and landscape variants. So you see here that the activity bar changed. It has 3 items here. And then when you go into the landscape version, it actually pulls that 3rd item out, becomes its own separate column in the view. And then in the segmented bar just becomes a split between recents and trending.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a really cool thing with NativeScript is the ability to just kind of split your views to a finite level and really control how you want them to be displayed. Now, I would advise for people that want to do things to this complexity is to pre-plan this. So the biggest part of design is to kind of know where your end goal is and be as decisive as possible to think ahead. So not always are you going to be able to do this, but if there's a chance that you might have a view like this where it's split, think ahead of how you want this container to render outside of it. So for Angular, the cool thing is you can use, ng templates and ng containers with content projection to change how you want it to display when, and that's really cool. But in terms of NativeScript core, you might have to do a lot more with like the visibility binding, or you might have to get at the code and actually remove it from the view and re-add it to the view.
And that's where some of the performance things that you talk about come in also, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say the biggest thing for us as we were building out our application is we thought really design heavy at first. So we built out our application to match our Envision designs, and we used a ton of containers to achieve it. And I would say that's where we kind of get into a bad place if you come from a web background into NativeScript. So I came from a web background, and when I came in, I was thinking very div mentality. And in web and with your browser's running on your computer's RAM in the browser. So it can handle a lot more to render, and you don't really notice the memory allocation of it. So when I jumped over to NativeScript, I'm like stack layout, grid layout, it's nesting things, 12 to 15 tiers deep. And obviously, as I'm designing it and as I'm building out my first applications, I'm like, this seems familiar. It looks really familiar to web because, you have your divs nested. But I'm like, I also don't know enough about native layouts at that time that I was like, this seems a little clunky. I feel like there's probably a better way to do it. And what happened is we built out all of our pages, and then we built it out for production for our first release. We put it on a device, and this is where you even get in bigger trouble. Put it on a device, and you start clicking through, and you tap, a navigation change, and you sit there for like 4 seconds, and then boom, then it would finally actually animate across into that new view. And we just kind of like look at each other and we're like, crap, like, what are we going to do? Why is it like this? Is this a NativeScript problem? Is this a development problem? Is it a device problem? Like, what did we do wrong, right? So
user error.
Yeah, or user error. It's always it works on my machine was like the first thing I said. And it did when we run it on the simulator. The simulator kind of lies to you because, again, the simulator, like your browser, is running with your whole laptop's device specs. So for me, I have a MacBook Pro with 16 gigs of RAM, which is significantly different than an Air 1 with 2 gigs of RAM or a gig of RAM even. So, we had to go back and we had to go like, okay, we've got to make this work for us. Like, what's going on? So the first thing we did was we just looked at how it actually rendered inside of Xcode. And the nice thing about Xcode is you can actually view your hierarchies, your view hierarchies, and you kind of see, how everything breaks down. So obviously the first time we put it in there, it was like a pyramid. I mean, it was like straight line, of like all these views that we're rendering.
Now, and, for those, just a second, for those that are not familiar with that, can you explain a little bit what Xcode can do for you and how it relates to NativeScript?
Yeah, so the cool thing about how NativeScript works is obviously it exports out an Xcode project specifically for iOS inside of your platforms folder. So when you build your project, you go into platforms and then you go in the iOS folder. There's a XC workspace project file, which is a Xcode project file. And then what you can do is you can open that project up, and I would recommend going through this workflow. You can run the application directly through Xcode. You don't have to use NativeScript's command line to do this. So you run it and run it to an emulator, attach it to an emulator. Don't attach it to a device. And then when it's running, you can actually go into tools and you can attach it to it. And what will happen is it'll add on the left-hand side some debugging tools that it's done. So it'll tell you, the memory output. It'll tell you, I think it's like the frames, and there's a few other metrics around as the device is booting and as the application's bootstrapping, what the memory specs are looking like. And at the bottom of it, there's a little icon, and if you hover over it, it says debug view hierarchy. And once you click that, it'll take a snapshot of the current user interface that's open up on the emulator, and it'll give you the split down. And it's actually very similar to Envision in terms of like you can click through your user interface and you can see what layout container it's actually tied to. Now, I would love to do this on air, but I'm pretty sure if I tried to run it and attach it while broadcasting, it would either lag up or crash. I've had that problem before. Now, it is available as part of the native scripting course for NativeScript Angular styling. We do kind of cover that topic. And for us, we back to the story of we went and we're like, okay, we've got like 100 containers per view. Like, what can we do to clean this up? So for styling, we went and we switched everything from stack layouts to grid layouts, and that was a huge time saver. So instead of 30 containers, we're using one pretty complex grid layout. And another thing we did is we just changed how things rendered on the view. So what I mean by that is anything that was design intensive. So any like media cards or list cards or any like fanciness to it, we would actually wrap in a set timeout a variable, and we would delay execution for say 1 second. So what would happen is you would actually navigate and then it would render a second later. And that was a significant improvement for us.
Yeah, we actually had an episode talking now about like how you should be layouting. I made up that word before, but how you should be layouting your application and how you should avoid nesting. And I think Brad Martin was even showing like the view in Xcode of how you kind of show like layout inside layout inside layout inside layout, kind of like as a tool. So I think that was episode number 2, so you can look it up as well. But probably it's better to even see than you guide people on how to do it, right?
Yeah, so for my example, I basically create in Angular, I use an ng4 and a repeater, and I think I render 1,000 layout containers on a view. It's 1,000 stack layouts with like 1,000 labels or something like that, and I let them see, as you're scrolling, because scrolling performance is kind of where you either have navigation lagginess or you have scrolling performance issues. It's usually the first two things where you're like, ooh, this app's getting a little bit sluggish. Like, what's going on here? Yeah. So I show as you're scrolling, and I actually open up an Xcode and I show the memory allocation, and you see when you go on that view, it goes from like 80 to 100 megabytes of allocated memory to like 400 to 800 to a gig, and then it just goes off the charts. Obviously, if you try to run that on a device, I'm pretty sure it would crash almost near instantly. But then I show by delaying execution by a second with that same use case of 1,000 containers, it still allocates a lot of memory, but instead of waiting 8 to 10 seconds for it to actually handle that switch for navigation, it switches immediately, renders the view, and then it delays execution until that actually renders. And that actually goes more into kind of what Alex was saying with animations. Animations have such a huge win in terms of user experience. So to advocate this for the story with our customers, we had a view where you'd switch and then you'd wait like 1.5 seconds to 2 seconds, and then the rest of our media would come in. And the time that it was taking was actually, it was half the network call of actually fetching the data off the database and returning it back. And the other half was to render it. And the customer's complaining that it's taking too long because 2 seconds, is a big deal. So all we did is, through just a simple little activity indicator, the stock activity indicator per iOS. And it was like, boom, near instant, ship to build to them. They're like, this is amazing. This is so much faster. But in reality, there's no time change in terms of how fast you're getting it, how fast it's rendering. But two, your brain, you're tricked because something's moving, something's keeping you engaged. Your brain's saying like, oh, something's happening. And then boom, new data's on the screen. They're like, this is great. Like whatever you did, perfect. So we went through our whole application, gutted out a lot of, we had some like stagnant, like fake SVG boxes. We'd gray out our media cards and we'd put like, I forget what they call it. I think it's like outlining or something, or maybe Alex,
placeholders. Yeah, I forgot the word itself. I just call them placeholders.
Yeah, so we put placeholders in places, and the problem with that is it would render and nothing's happening. There's no flash, there's no movement, there's no nothing. They'd sit there for a second and a half, and then the actual cards would come in. Pulled all those out, put activity indicators in, and it was just like we were their best friends. It was like a whole new app for them. They're like, this is so much more performant, and obviously to a developer, you know, you're kind of like, really? Is it really more important or more performant? I don't think so. But animation is just a huge win, and I think for design, it's as much about how it looks as how it feels. And if you don't have a good balance of look and feel, you're going to have an app that either isn't usable or the customer is going to hate it because it just doesn't work well for them.
Perception is key, right?
Pretty much,
in this case.
Yeah, exactly. The perception and what people really kind of see what's happening is like, if nothing's moving, nothing's happening. It's like, did I click it? Did something happen? Did it break? And actually in Angular, they have a really cool feature where you could set up your navigation so that you could, for example, make say, oh, navigate only, like, sorry, you want, before you navigate, do this task first and then perform the navigation. So you could, for example, say, okay, I have a list view, I want to click on an item, then I want to get the specific object and then show the detailed object. So what you could do is basically start the spinner, pull the, like, request the data, and then as soon as you get the data, then perform the navigation. And that's also like a different perception. Overall, from moment to click to when you see the data is exactly the same time, but then what happens is also different. So yeah, maybe somebody wants to see the rest of the list until the actual record is ready. So yeah, there's different things you can do.
Absolutely. And I mean, if you're like a new person coming into NativeScript, especially NativeScript Angular, I would say lazy loading is like the first key thing to doing that well. It's a significant difference of just having some stock UI of maybe your bottom action or your bottom navigation bar and maybe your action bar is just like the root UI, that it's the outer shell, and then just lazy load project all your other screens inside that inner container. That is just one, a huge win in terms of just bootstrap time in general. And two, the experience goes from just waiting on a white screen for 4 or 5 seconds for it to bootstrap to your fully loaded screen to waiting maybe a second and a half, getting some nice UI, feeling, again, you're right, you're seeing something new, and then having that UI come in. And I think you can just iterate on that immensely. You could go lazy loading, then you can start offloading UI. And what I mean by that is like that delayed execution of just waiting a second to two of rendering, maybe not even a second to two, depending on how complex your UI is. Again, to Angular, that's kind of where my bread and butter is, but the Angular lifecycle of hooks, like, experiment with those. So there's a reason why they're called what they are. The on init is when the component actually initializes, not when the component renders. So, you know, playing with after maybe the view initializes, which is the ng after view init, doing something there, maybe start your execution there when the screen's already rendered natively, will actually help performance-wise. Some of the other things feel like they're a little bit more snappier, opposed to on init. A lot of people do that because a lot of the base examples show on init, and they're just shoving everything in that on init lifecycle hook. And what happens is it has to do all of that before it actually can render the view. I mean, that's the problem with everything on one thread, with how the view is rendered, is it locks up the thread until it's released, and then it moves on to the next execution.
Yeah. By the way, while we were talking, I did your steps that you were just talking about and opened up the project that I had in Xcode. I can show what that looks like if anybody would care to see.
Absolutely.
I do.
So awesome. So this is the app that I was talking about. It's a NativeScript application, and the code for it is, well, the code for it is somewhere here. There it is. And I just open up the platforms folder, the iOS folder, and there's the Xcode project. So I open that up in Xcode. And there's my memory. I just press play. That's all I have to do. And there's this there's this cool little feature called debug, and I think this is what Sean was talking about. And you can view debugging, capture view hierarchy. So this will show me if I have an app that's going to perform well or not based on all the different views that I have. So you can see all the native views that are being rendered here, and you can kind of take a look at in 3D what your app looks like with all the different containers, with all the different widgets on there, images. They're all separated out into their own individual views that are in 3D. So I think this is what you're talking about, Sean. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, a good indicator of where I can clean something up is where I see like 5 or 6 UI views that are nested. That usually where you run into that, and for our application, we're thinking very component specific. So, you know, we're working on a micro component. And for us, we'd have like a reusable Angular component, and we'd stick like a stack layout around it inside the component. And then we keep doing that per component instead of thinking very like global of our page. Like, what does our page look like? And what we did is we realized, like, for the list cells, we have everything's very flat. Like, you might open up our list cell component, and it'll just have label, image, and it won't even have a grid layout at all in it. And the idea is our parent view that consumes that child view actually creates the shape of the page. It'll actually create the grid layout, and it'll attach itself to it.
Oh, that's interesting. Very cool. So is there any other code we want to take a look at, or?
Depends what you have. Do you have any nice animations you could show us, or some hints? I remember the great talk you gave at the first NativeScript Developer Day.
Yeah, that's out on YouTube. So if somebody wants to take a look at that, there's definitely there on YouTube. I don't have any of those projects open right now, unfortunately, but
I could probably show an animation. Now, it's not anything glamorous, but it's kind of back to that subtleness of just adding kind of a little bit of flair to it to make it feel a little bit better. This will be interesting. We'll just do this ad hoc and see how it goes.
Yay! Now, this is a live coding demo.
This is a brand new application that, or not a brand new application, a brand new element of our application that we're adding. Obviously, some of the designs we're just kind of mocking out as placeholders. But inside of this application, there's actually a video stream that goes behind this kind of white space here. It doesn't actually work on the simulator because it uses the webcam built in. So you actually have to run it on the device to see it. But the animation, if you saw that, kind of flies in here. As you go between these different tabs, it just kind of slides across the screen real quick, right? And it doesn't matter what orientation you're on. Well, I say that, now it's probably not gonna do it. But once you've oriented, it kind of attaches itself to the component. And how I've done that, I'll bring over, this is where the live coding gets a little bit funky. I have this role play component, and that's what this is. And then inside my role play component, I have these buttons, and then that actual bottom border that you're seeing is a label. And I'm actually just translating the label between the positions. And what happens is when I tap on a button, I pass in the value here, the index of it, and I say what I pass in the full button element using just the kind of the view child lookups inside of Angular. And if we actually look at that function, which is right here, and I'll zoom in a little bit.
Can you make your code slightly bigger? Oh, yeah.
There we go. So what happens is I check if they passed in a valid, if a button element, or if it's undefined. And then based on what index it is, I actually do some calculations to determine its position and its width, and I split it, and I have a little bit of offset, and I actually animate it back and forth. And I did find a bug while doing this that the CSS colors would not update in this view. So I actually had to manually grab my brand color and assign it to that button after it became active. And then I would, after I've set all these properties, the animation itself is just as simple as just animating, passing in this translate value. If you're not familiar with some of the ES6 things, this is the same as doing that. But because the variables have the same name, you can just use this handy shortcut like that and just say X. And then the curve, the animation curves, that's probably like the biggest thing for me with animations is if you don't use the correct animation curve, it has like a really odd feel to it. And for me, ease in, ease in out is just like a smooth acceleration to a deceleration. So it just feels like it accelerates quickly and then it slows down as it's coming to the end of where it's going to be. And that just for me has like a huge win. It just feels very smooth.
Nice.
Totally
So
agree
yeah,
with you on that, Sean. I gotta use some kind of curve on there. And there's a really good site called cubicbezier.com, which you can use to sort of visualize your animation curves if you need something a little bit more custom than ease in and ease out.
Yep, and I would say that NativeScript, at least their updated documentation when I was taking a look within the last, I'd say, month, was awesome. It had the little NativeScript boxes and it was showing how the different animation curves that are built in look like. And that was a huge win for me of just knowing which one was the right fit for that experience. And for me, for the tab view change, the ease in and out just had a really nice appeal to me.
Yeah.
Nice, nice. Have you tried also using the Angular animations, or do you just use the standard ones mostly?
So at least for my use case, I've done a lot with just the standard ones, doing it mostly in code. As this application has kind of grown in size, we've realized that for performance, it has become more advantageous for us to do things as much through code as possible, to have the most control and understanding of what's going on. Now, that's not always the use case, but for like layout generations, we're starting to investigate if it makes sense to build things in that HTML, XML markup, or if it makes more sense to do it directly through code. Obviously, doing it directly through code gets a little bit more hairy as the views get a little bit more complicated, but we're hopeful that we can come up with some good reusable functions and some framework mentalities to help make that view generation a little bit easier. So for us, at this point, we do mostly the stock in-code animations, but you can use the Angular ones. I just haven't personally had good luck with them for what animations we've had to do at this point.
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, like the whole point of, for me at least, with the Angular animations was that you could also quite easily reuse the animations in your web and your mobile project because the code is pretty much identical. So if you come up with like a nice animation, let's say the component goes around, and then ends up in the middle, then you could actually, let's say, save that animation as an object, and you could import it into both mobile and web projects and use it everywhere.
Yeah, and that is a nice win of that. If anybody's interested in kind of the CSS approach, not so much the code or the Angular one, I do have a repo, the Flappy Bird app, that obviously it hasn't been updated, but that one does show some different approaches to how to do animations. It also shows some limitations too. So for instance, on iOS, the frames seem to be rendering better. So you can actually use a background position with like a sprite, like a image where it's a different breakdown of that Flappy Bird, and it'll actually cleanly animate the flapping of the bird by translating the image up smoothly. Now you throw that on an Android device and it does not behave at all how you would expect it to. I'm a big iOS advocate, so I could just blame the Android device, but I would just say that if you're building a game, that would probably not be the best bet for it. There's alternatives that you could use in Android to achieve a similar look.
That's a good
Fair enough. Cool. So what else? What you guys got? So Alex, you mentioned well, both of you, Alex and Sean, you mentioned a course that goes with styling. Can you give us a bit more details about that?
Sure, I can share my screen. Sean, thanks for sharing the code and the demo. I know it's sometimes a little rough to show live coding on and especially when it's not finished. But for those that are interested in Sean's new course, you can go to nativescripting.com and go down to where it says, let's see, you can select Angular here, and there's Shawns Course right there. Sean does go into some real world scenarios here, which is really cool, and it's really special for him to share. That he's basically sharing some techniques that he's actually experienced on the job, which is what his company, Team Maestro, does. So this is his course. I definitely recommend you check it out. And for those that are listening to the show today, and actually for a month, I'll let this coupon code go on for a month. It'll expire on April 20th. This is the coupon code if you want to use it to get a 20% discount on Shawns Course, as well as the other ones on native scripting.
Excellent. And by the way, yeah, all three of us today are wearing the native scripting t-shirts. So, you know, like we strongly believe in that. That could do a nice screenshot as well. So yeah, like you like if you guys want to learn more about some of the things we talked about, I definitely recommend checking out those courses because they're pretty awesome. So it's always a good way to learn a little bit of the topics that we are trying to cover today. So yeah, like I think like the conclusion for me is, at least from this episode, before you start coding, start with design and then agree on the design early, because doing that with code is very, very time consuming. And we looked at the number of tools, and we also I'm gonna provide links to all the tools and the website that we talked about in the description of the video channel. So yeah, use the right tools. Try to use the tools that help you. Let's say pick the colors, pick the margins and distances between and padding between all the components. And then once you agreed on the design with your customer, then dive into the code and start working on that. And then also, I think like another thing that stood out for me was basically don't let things just hang in there. But then like as soon as you do something, and if it takes more than half a second or a second, add a spinner or do something to kind of notify that something is happening. If you clicked on a button, clicked on a little heart, make it explode or make it do something to tell users that they did something, and yes, like yeah, we got it. You did something. Let me take care of that. So I think those are pretty good conclusions for me. Did I miss anything?
Yeah, don't go crazy with animations. Just do enough to get some information across. And remember, animation as information. You want to convey information to the user. You don't want to go crazy and just create random animations.
It's all about consistency. So
yeah, because like if you just animate for the sake of animation, if you don't have the purpose, then basically it's just going to be messy. You're just going to watch like an ant's nest, and it's like, well, the ants know what they're doing, but your app doesn't. So that definitely wouldn't help. So yeah, okay, guys, thanks a lot for your time. This was like really informative. I absolutely loved it. So we should definitely get you back online with us. So I'm gonna I'll probably need you to give me all the links and everything so that I can share with everyone. Yeah, thanks for joining us, and to our audience, thanks for listening, and have a good day. Bye.
This was fun. Thanks.
bye, guys.
Bye.